So let me start with just a quick run through. So corruption in the arms trade is a massive driver of global military spending and accounts for an estimated 40% of corruption in all global transactions. As such, it's a key issue for anyone trying to understand and counter the global military industrial complex and patriarchal structures of world governance it sustains. The Corruption Tracker project aims to create an up-to-date online tracker of all cases and robust allegations of corruption in the global arms trade. And the project brings together a network of journalists, academics, and activists in the field who contribute to an online database documenting the cases and allegations in order to expose and oppose the systematic ways in which the global arms business poisons the well of politics worldwide. So this is kind of like the general framework which the project is about and which we will be discussing today. Our first speaker will be Andrew Feinstein, who you've just met. And what he hasn't told you is, or partly has told you, is that he's a former South African parliamentarian and one of the world's leading experts on corruption in the arms trade. So we're very excited to have him here. And in addition to that, he's been like the initiator basically of the Corruption Tracker project through his UK-based organization Shadow World Investigations, which, in addition, he's also the author of Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade. We've also just discussed the book, which is the movie, which is connected to it. Definitely check it out. It's a long read, but it's a read definitely worth the time. And what he didn't mention before is that he, as a member of the South African Parliament, which he was part of for over 7 years, he ended up resigning in 2001 in protests at the ANC's refusal to countenance an independent and comprehensive inquiry into a multi-billion-dollar arms deal, which was tainted by allegations of high-level corruptions. I think at this case, it might be the easiest if I just hand over to Andrew, and then I will do the introductions for Susan and Ruth directly before they speak, so that I don't go on now for like 5 minutes just listing things and you will forget until we actually get to the amazing speakers. So in that case, I would give over to Andrew and have fun.
Thanks so much, Julia. And thank you so much to all of you who've organized this session. I think it's a really, really important session. And the importance of the session is probably reflected both in the work that Wilf does, but also in the fact that the Corruption Tracker, which might have been initiated by Shadow World Investigations. I can't remember where it arose, but the extraordinary thing about the Corruption Tracker for a project that focuses on a crucial aspect of the global arms trade is that it is almost exclusively run and has been since long before its inception by a group of young women in various parts of the world. And I'm going to come back to this at the end of my talk because I think it is a reflection of something quite fundamental that is changing with regard to work on security and work on the global arms trade that I think is crucial and that gives me a great deal of hope. But let's start with perhaps the most fundamental point about why there is a need for something like a corruption tracker. And that is that the global trade in weapons, which is usually worth about $400 billion a year, which is actually not that much money. If you think about some other trades, if you think about the oil industry, for instance, if you think about the financial services industry, pharmaceuticals, this is not a huge business. But despite that fact, it accounts for around 40% of all corruption in all global trade. And that is quite extraordinary. And that corruption has all sorts of impacts. It has impacts not just on people's safety and broadly on human security, which I'll talk about in a moment. It has impacts on what our government does not spend money on. Because every time money is spent on an arms deal, and don't forget, that the bribes are paid for by the taxpayers in both the buying, but also the selling country. The bribes aren't free. They don't get manufactured. Taxpayers are paying for those bribes, which amount, as I'll give you some examples of in a moment, to billions of dollars in and of themselves. There is a social and economic opportunity cost. So every time a dollar or a euro is spent on an arms transaction, that's a dollar or a euro that is not being spent on far more pressing needs that I think are far more important to our security as human beings. Public health care being the most obvious one at the moment. Dealing with the greatest threat to us, which is obviously the climate crisis. And so many other things. I mean, in many countries, in my own country, South Africa, housing, basic nutrition, enough schools and teachers for everybody to be able to access education. But why does this trade account for such an inordinately high amount of the corruption? Well, every year, there are only a few major arms deals that are concluded, and they are each worth billions of dollars themselves. They're also incredibly important for a variety of political and economic reasons to the politicians in the buying and the selling countries. And I say politicians specifically rather than the people of those countries, because I would argue that those interests are actually different and often in conflict. And I say this as what the former American deputy president or vice president Al Gore would describe, as he described himself, myself as a recovering politician. Because what I realized in my 7.5 years in formal politics and many years before and after that in less formal politics, which are far more rewarding, is that the interests of individual politicians and often political parties most times don't actually align with the interests of the majority of the citizens of their countries. So a few huge deals every year that are of importance to people who are in very influential positions. Very few people make the decision about what equipment to buy and who to buy it from. So in the case of a big South African arms deal that I tried to investigate, that was worth $10 billion, when South Africa had massive, pressing socioeconomic needs. 6 people, 6 cabinet ministers made the decisions about what equipment to buy and who to buy it from. The most important dimension, though, is that everything that happens in one of these arms deals happens behind a veil of national security imposed secrecy. And the combination of those 3 factors make the arms trade the most extraordinarily fertile environment for unfettered corruption to take place. And then you add to that, after the fact, the reality that criminal activity and conduct in areas of national security, including the arms trade, are often treated with virtual legal impunity. So in the book, The Shadow World, we recorded 502 recorded violations of UN arms embargoes. This is up to mid-2011, so quite out of date now. Of those, 2 led to any form of legal accountability whatsoever. 1 led to a conviction and a fine for an arms dealer who, when I interviewed him, laughed at me and said that fine was pocket change on the $158 million profit I made on violating the 2 UN arms embargoes he broke at the same time. So impunity is a big issue as well. And then there is the closeness of the weapons making companies to their governments. So for instance, in the United Kingdom, the senior executives of BAE Systems, the biggest defense company in the UK, have the same level of security clearance as the Minister for Defense, the defense secretary in this country. So can walk onto any military site into any classified meeting that they want to. The government has absolutely no stake in BAE Systems. But that is the sort of access that they have. And their influence on policy, not just defense policy, but economic policy, foreign policy, is huge and immense. Now, we see this coming to manifest in all sorts of deals. The most corrupt commercial transaction in recorded history, the Al Yamamah deal between the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia. £6 billion of bribes were paid on that deal. That's with a B, not an M. £6 billion of bribes, including £12 million paid to the son of the Prime Minister who signed that deal, Margaret Thatcher, for absolutely nothing. And she refused to sign the final contract until her son had received the £12 million. Prince Bandar, the son of the Saudi defense minister at the time, Bandar was the Saudi ambassador to the United States at the time, was paid a bribe of just over £1 billion. But in case that wasn't enough, he was also given as a birthday gift by BAE Systems, paid for by the British taxpayer, who continued to pay for the running and maintenance of the aircraft until at least 2017, was the birthday gift of an Airbus jet painted in the colors of his favorite American football team, the Dallas Cowboys. Helmut Kohl, the reunifier of Germany, funded his Christian Democratic Union for 16 years on the proceeds of both licit and illicit arms deals. Still 48 hours before Kohl died fairly recently, he was protesting his innocence and threatening to sue anybody who claimed he was corrupt. In the Shadow World book, we go into a lot of detail about an investigation that Der Spiegel did that showed Kohl and his then foreign minister, Franz Josef Strauss, receiving money both personally and crucially for their political parties from that deal through an arms dealer called Karl-Heinz Schreiber, who had to flee Germany and lived for many years in exile in Canada until a few years before he died. He returned to Germany, did a deal where he was found guilty of a few minor tax offenses and paid a fine. The current Prime Minister of Sweden, for Ida, who I think I heard was in Malmo. The current Prime Minister of Sweden, before he went into politics in this way, was head of international relations at the Swedish Metal Workers Union. In that capacity, he facilitated a bribe of 500,000 South African rands to the South African Metal Workers Union, who were then in alliance with the ruling ANC government, of which I was a part, in order to ensure that the trade union supported Saab's bid for the jet fighter contract, even though they hadn't even managed to make it onto the shortlist. Unsurprisingly, they won the contract, having not been shortlisted, but having paid at a minimum £115 million of bribes. Now, that South African arms deal, which I referred to before, this was at a time when Nelson Mandela was stepping down from office and his successor, Thabo Mbeki, was taking over. Mbeki, at virtually the same moment that we announced we were spending $10 billion on weapons that the country had absolutely no need of, most of which we've never used until today. The Saab jet fighters, 14 of the 24 fighters bought have never left the ground. Some of them have never even been assembled because South Africa cannot afford the fuel for them, cannot afford to train the pilots, and has absolutely no need of the planes. According to the head of the Air Force, what we actually needed were transport planes to deal with humanitarian disasters in our own country and around sub-Saharan Africa. But we have these 14 jet fighters, sitting either in boxes or in hangars, wasting money. This was at the time when 6 million South Africans were living with HIV or AIDS. But Mbeki announced that we did not have the finances to provide life-saving antiretroviral medication to any of those 6 million people. As a consequence, according to a conservative study undertaken at Harvard University, over the following 5 years, that policy choice led to the avoidable deaths of 365,000 South Africans and the birth of 32,000 HIV-positive babies a year for each of the 5 years. But at least we had the planes from Saab. Now, the purpose of the corruption tracker, as Ruth will later explain to you, is for the first time to have an up-to-date online tracker of all cases of corruption in the global arms trade and all solid, verifiable allegations of corruption. Because the time has come for those involved in this trade to actually face the legal consequences of what they do. Because what they do is not only affect their own countries negatively, undermine democracy, the rule of law, ensure that money is diverted from real needs to created needs. The arms trade is also responsible for over 500,000 deaths a year across the world, and for massive human suffering, immiseration, and dislocation. So why does this happen? Well, the reality is that what is described in the film by Lawrence Wilkerson, who was Colin Powell's chief of staff, both when he was chair of the Joint Chief of Staffs and when he was Secretary of State, the so-called national security elite, the tiny elite of people globally who benefit most from this trade, are the ones who decide the modus operandi of the trade and the money diverted to it. Some of them benefit personally. Tony Blair, since leaving office, has made somewhere between 60 and 80 million pounds personally out of his decision to invade Iraq, which resulted in the deaths of over 1 million people, and the work that he did facilitating corrupt arms deals for BAE Systems around the world. When I was trying to investigate the South African arms deal in the South African Parliament, BAE Systems were paying bribes of a similar order, so over 100 million pounds, in at least 7 other transactions at the same time. So yes, our then Deputy President, Jacob Zuma, who took a bribe, should face justice. And ironically, he will face justice in May. I'll be giving evidence against him along with 208 other witnesses in his corruption trial in relation to that arms deal. But who is actually more corrupt? Jacob Zuma, who took the equivalent of 25,000 pounds, which is appalling and unforgivable, or Tony Blair, through whose office BAE was paying over £1 billion of bribes around the world. And it's ironic that it is Jacob Zuma who faces justice. Gerhard Schröder did all sorts of dodgy deals, not many of them in the arms trade. He did more in the oil and energy sector with Russia in particular. And of course, as you all know, joined Gazprom immediately he left office. And it's for this reason that we have these insane defense budgets. So that the US and the UK, I mean, Donald Trump passed a defense budget of over $750 billion in the last fiscal year, in which his appalling stay in the White House concluded. The United Kingdom, at the height of the COVID pandemic, announced a £17 billion increase in our defense budget. And that's in addition to the fact that we're going to be spending £209 billion renewing our Trident nuclear deterrent, which is actually non-existent as a nuclear deterrent, but that's another subject. Interesting that these two countries, amongst the richest in the world, at the start of the COVID pandemic, could not provide their frontline healthcare workers with even the most basic safety equipment like gloves and masks. But they could continue to increase their defense budgets. And this is because national security takes precedence over human security. It's reflected most obviously to me in the case of the United States of America, that what they want is conflict over diplomacy by the fact that there are more people employed by the US government to run and maintain one aircraft carrier than the United States of America has diplomats across the globe. Today, the United States of America has 11 aircraft carriers and is building a 12th. Very quickly, because I realize my time is almost up, there's a lot that I won't be able to get through, but maybe it'll come out in Q&A, is the other thing that the arms trade and the sort of insane militarism that we have does, is that it creates what C. Wright Mills described as a military metaphysic. That is, that we see the world through a militaristic lens. So our world is colored, if you will, by the patriarchal notions that inform our politics, our economics, our racial and gender relations. Militarism is driven by this bizarre notion, this sort of manifestation in theory of machoism, the survival of the fittest mythology. And I was going to talk a little bit about how that comes through in popular culture, but we can do that in Q&A. I also just want to mention in conclusion that it's important to note that when someone blows the whistle on this national security elite, on what our militaries actually do around the world, they are attacked for the very opposite of what our militarism does. So in Chelsea Manning's case, her gender identity was a constant topic of conversation, and it was seen as absurd, if not repulsive, that she actually wanted to go through with her transition while she was in jail for exposing the war crimes of the American government and its military. Chelsea Manning, rather than the soldiers who go into combat, 80% of whom, by the way, soil themselves when they go into combat. But that's not something we see in Hollywood films. Chelsea Manning is an example of true heroism. So let me finally say that when I started doing this work unintentionally 20 years ago, there was very little diversity of people working on these issues, especially narrowly related to the arms trade. They all looked and sounded like me. They were middle-aged white men. I have seen, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, a significant change. And that is thanks to the work of Wilp and others that things are really changing. And that's why I think when we talk about militarism, we have to understand it within what is sometimes described as intersectional politics, because we cannot understand the nature of our militarism without understanding the nature, including the gender relationships of the societies in which we live. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm just going to remove your pin. Thank you so much. This was really, honestly, it's always great to hear you again. And thank you so much for highlighting, it's hard to summarize, but for really highlighting the consequences for democracies that are kind of just due to the inflated military expenditure that we see, the human lives lost due to arms trade, and also the need for an intersectional approach to militarism. And I'm really happy that we're bringing in that topic of the debate, because yeah, we've talked about it internally with the corruption tracker, but we really hope that we can kind of focus in on that aspect of the work as well, to just kind of bring in that gender lens, that intersectional lens. And that's why we're really happy that we have this kind of webinar today to exchange with all of you on your expertise on the topic. now we have an expert on the topic of a feminist perspective on the arms trade with us today. And it's already been an absolute pleasure to be corresponding with her via email the last weeks. Now we will be hearing from Dr. Susan Jackson, who's an affiliated researcher with the Department of Economic History and International Relations at Stockholm University. Her most recent publication includes a multi-authored forum on Militarization 2.0, Communication and the Normalization of Political Violence in the Digital Age. She sent us a list of her resources, and if you subscribe to the Corruption Tracker email newsletter, we will send out basically like a follow-up email after this event today with all the resources. Just because since you signed up over WILP, we don't legally have access to your email addresses from like a data protection standpoint. So if you do want to have the follow-up email, you would have to subscribe to our mailing list, please. But so she's provided us with like a whole lot, like longer list of her resources, which I'm really excited about reading. Her research also focuses on militarization and the global political economy, with an emphasis on the role of corporations and industry actors. She's given me a bit of a description of what she's going to be talking on today, but she's also kept it a little bit as a mystery. But so her presentation will discuss meaning construction and how the way we treat militarism in everyday life works to normalize it. This treatment has a lot of underlying assumptions that are very gendered in a variety of ways. She will furthermore discuss how corruption is less about individual acts of corruption and more about the underlying system that supports corruption, a masculinized behavior in a highly masculinized sector, like picking, I think also what Andrew just has said, just also reiterating that in a more kind of detailed manner. And that masculinity comes from the bodies that tend to inhabit the space, but also from how we privilege the industry over others, and what that means in people's everyday lives and in our foreign policies. I'm really, really happy to have her here today and super excited. So I'm going to give the floor to Susan Jackson, and let me know if you need any help with your presentation or anything.
Great. Can you hear me? Okay, so hopefully this will work. I'm going to share my screen, and then I'm going to pick my PowerPoint. Let's see if it'll work. Can you only see the slides, right, and not all of my stuff? You can see all of my stuff?
We can still see, like on the right hand side, we can see the next slide and your notes underneath it.
Oh, that's not supposed to happen. That's all right. I mean, those notes are just there in case I forget why I have a slide there. So I can just leave it if you want. I don't know how to fix it otherwise, so.
I think it's not an issue from our side. You can click on use slideshow. Yeah, I think that's perfect.
Yeah, but now I can't see my notes.
Well, no, then go back.
And I was also like, I know exactly what I'm doing. I don't know how to get back. So I'll just wing it and we'll see how it goes.
Maybe click on escape. Yes.
I'll just okay. Wing it and see how it goes. So I am going to try and shrink everyone down though, because I don't need to see myself. Okay, so I'm Susan, and I've been working on the arms trade, or specifically actually on the arms industry, global arms industry, for a little over 20 years. I'm part of the WILP academic network, which is something that kind of works in the background of WILP right now, trying to figure out how academics can support what WILP's doing out in trying to change the world. So I was invited today to try and pull in a feminist lens on the arms trade and corruption. So I think it's really quite fitting when Andrew was talking about the militaristic lens and coloring how we see things. I have to ask though that you maybe somehow signal me. I don't know how, if I'm going over, because I no longer have the clock because it went away. I'll try and pay attention to my phone. Anyway, thank you. Okay, thank you so much for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to work with the people that have been putting together Corruption Tracker, and now that I'm like here in Germany, to be part of WILP Germany, so that's also kind of cool. And it's always nice to be able to hear Andrew talk some more. So I really enjoyed that. Oh, it won't actually advance. Oh, there. Sorry, showing my age. So what I did is I put together just some like data-oriented slides that I grabbed from the CIPRI website, where I used to work on the arms production project years ago, not so long, but enough. And I wanted to just kind of show you how big things are in the arms trade and what kind of countries are involved in the top side of exporting and importing. And to kind of go back to, now that, Andrew mentioned about Zuma, it's interesting that he's the one that's facing justice. And I think that's part of that intersectional lens that we need to use, like who counts and when do they count and how do we take care of that? So the slides here show the biggest exporters. We're not surprised, it's the US and Russia. But these are very much countries that are primarily from the global north. We often think of them as friendly and democracies and these kinds of things. And if you look then on the importer side, some of those are countries that we regularly would work with, but a lot of them are actually horrific human rights violators. And we ignore, when we make the decisions to sell weapons to them, we ignore these human rights violations, which are often perpetrated on women and are gender-based sexual violence. I wanted to just show a little bit about German industry, the arms industry, because this is where I'm sitting now, is in Germany, and a lot of the people who are attending. But I thought it's interesting. One of the things that a lot of people often don't realize is that companies participate in other companies, right? So the two of the top German arms producers are actually through, or German's arms sales are through companies that are trans-European, so Airbus and MBDA. And if you don't know to look for Airbus as a German, with Germany as a participant, you would miss that Airbus is part of all of this. And that brings us in a minute to the corruption tracker, or in a couple of minutes, and how to search for things. What looking at arms production by country, which is often how we do it, is to then miss the internationalization of the arms industry, right? So a recent report out by CIPRI shows how the top producers, where they have other facilities that they're manufacturing in, and that increases the opportunities for corruption, right? So you get a company like Lockheed Martin, one of the largest arms producer in the world, and they're operating in a lot of different regions and not just based in the US. So then how corruption works in different countries, who's involved, and how to manage it is actually, or track it and investigate it, becomes complicated. It's hard to know what these companies are doing. Another aspect is from a researcher who tracks monopolies. And one of the things that he has put together is looking at the arms industry. And recently he wrote a piece on how when you consolidate the arms industry so much, you have a difficult time penalizing companies that behave badly, because you then don't have an arms producer to go to. You get stuck with this, like, okay, there are 5 major arms producers in the US now, whereas 30 years ago, there were dozens. So what happens when you can no longer change where you're doing your contracting? Right, so that's an element that plays into corruption. Underlying all of this is an intersectional feminist lens. So I tend to look at how we talk about, how the images we use, the things that we do in meaning construction, how we can use the intersection of things like gender, race, ethnicity, class, heteronormativity. I've done some work on that and how we present male bodies in certain ways in order to reinforce heterosexuality in relation to arms production, though why we would need to do that is a mystery, not quite, but it is a little bit. So rather than talk in a more kind of lecture on this is how intersectional feminist lens would work, what I wanted to do is move on to an overview on corruption, and then kind of put the power of the arms industry, something that Andrew mentioned, also the power of the intersectional feminist lens, what it can lend to us, and then the corruption part, to see how they fit together, and some experience that I've had in my own life. To go into the corruption part, what I wanted to do is tell you a little bit about an experience I had when I was ready to leave university. I would finish my PhD or just about to, and wanted to get a really good job. And this is a picture of the Washington, D.C. Convention Center, actually in a neighborhood that 10 years before I had lived in, and it was like a bombed out type neighborhood that people, would run through and try and avoid. They regentrified it by building this convention center. And in it, they had a jobs fair for the people who had been accepted to the Presidential Management Fellowship. So people who were earning PhDs and law degrees, and the government, the federal government in the US, wanted them to work for the government so that they would give them 2 years of funding and they'd stay in the government, they'd get trained, and then maybe they would just continue. And the federal government then has all this brain power. And so I went to this jobs fair with the intention of trying to get a job at the Department of State in order to work with their licensing team to help decide, do the research to help decide what countries deserved to get licensed, with the intention that I would stay for the 2 years and then I would leave and I would have firsthand knowledge on how to deal with all of this stuff. So I went to the job fair and I'm, standing there, and one guy I was standing next to made a sexist remark. And so I called him out on it. And the next day I go back to the job fair and I go to this interview, and it turns out that he was the interviewer. So I basically sat through an interview while this young man and his partner, and they were younger than I was at the time, just kind of scowling at me. Can you do this job? What makes you think you can do this job? And it was like really, really very awkward. And I said, well, somebody has to do it. And so why would you think I can't? But I didn't get the job. And the point of this is the masculinity that is assumed not just in the people who are in these positions of power, but the language and the assumptions they have about what should be privileged and what's important is also gendered. And I think it's part of that system where the corruption comes in, because it's already protected. So there's a really interesting article, I think, from 2013 following the financial crisis. It's based on corruption in Iceland, and it's an interesting feminist understanding of expanding the definition of corruption so that it's less of an individual transactional one and more of a moral systemic problem. And I think that fits really well with what Andrew was just talking about, where these individual factors are really key in being able to track them all down. We really do need to have that kind of data. And they are powerful instances where the corruption does take things from people who need what they're not getting, whether it's medicine, whether it's some kind of other social service. And you put them together, you can see how the system is actually supporting this problem. So it's not just BAE Systems, and it's not just South Africa and Tony Blair, working together and corrupting things, or Margaret Thatcher, coming in, and her son. And these are really important, and they just illustrate how the system is in place and how it's gendered, and it works against us, and it works against human security. The second quote I have is actually something Andrew had in one of the SIPRI yearbooks with a few of his colleagues about how, and he mentioned this before, about how the arms deals, they're opaque. It's a small group of people. It's a small group of almost always men making decisions. And it's really difficult then for the public to monitor and hold these officials, these people who are making these decisions, accountable. part of that's also gendered, where women are disempowered. We're not as much a part of the corruption system, maybe not because we're just naturally nicer people, maybe because the structures are in place that promote certain kinds of power relationships. So when women aren't part of these systems, they're even less empowered to be able to hold people accountable. And there's a whole literature that you can read on that. There's just a lot of complicated ways that things come together, and I like connecting the system and that every day. So I went through the corruption tracker. I'm specifically looking for German arms exporters or arms producers, and I found that there are 8 cases that are currently listed. If you look at the different countries that are involved, some of them are actually NATO members. So German industry is corrupt with NATO members, right? We're supposed to be on the same side. There are, South Korea, right? It's supposed to be another democracy. These are not dictators for the most part, right? These are supposed to be, countries that are peer in our peer group. So I think it just goes to show how complicated corruption is, and the assumptions that we tend to have, like we need to maybe open up a little bit and take a broader look, because the system is in place and just everywhere. But when you consider back to that internationalization aspect, you consider back to how Germany and like all the other countries, they're parts of other companies, right? These German companies, you get Airbus Eurofighter sales to Austria as a corruption problem, right? So when we look at how corruption's working, I think it's important to remember that structure matters, and which actors can be in multiple places. So I did just a very, very quick content like pick of words. So a lot of my research is based on, as I said, meaning construction. And I've looked a lot at how the arms industry sells national security, whether through things like their websites, which is what I put here, or I have some work I've done on YouTube videos, and how they like the gendered, raced, and ethnicity based and heteronormative stories they tell us in order to not sell a weapon system we can't buy, but to sell us this notion of a masculine national security that's based on military security. And so these words are just like, ooh, friendly forces, they don't do anything wrong, or defense portfolio, like, I don't know, recent grads, right? You're told maybe you should have something online to showcase like what you can do. It's your portfolio. I don't really think of, a portfolio of helicopters as something that's probably the same as like something I would present as my own website, but protection comes up a lot. Experience and passion. So these are things that normalize this very masculine, very aggressive way of dealing with security, right? There are also ways, I'm going to see if this will work. There are also ways that these companies sell us like these systems, these ideas. I mean, you just look at this and it's so elegant, right? These kind of things moving around, but yet they're powerful and they're scary, and they're for men to go out and operate, right? So it's just things like this when I talk about meaning construction, and you can see, and recognize the type of gendering that goes into normalizing this kind of militarism as the end all and be all. I'm going to try and remember the details of this. I'm actually almost done, but this is Kockums. It's in actually Malmö in the south of Sweden. The picture is the old building is from, it's a file photo from Radio Sweden. And what happened, I think in 2014, there was a dispute between Germany and Sweden over Kockums, right? So it had been a Swedish company that had gotten sold to a German company. And then the German company wanted to be, maybe wanted to get rid of Kockums as a competitor. And so there was a lot of controversy over whether or not that sale should have gone through. It was supposed to enhance Kockums. Sweden insisted as a national sovereignty thing that Kockums should have the proprietary information for one of the engines that had been developed in Sweden, so it wasn't allowed to leave to Germany. All this stuff going on. And there was so much controversy that the Swedish Defense Material Agency administration that takes care of, weapons stuff, went in, invaded Kockums, and tried to see if there was any illegal stuff going on. And I bring it up because it's an interesting thing where, in the arms industry, there are certain protections, and then they're very much, national sovereignty bound, right? This idea that national security isn't about the people, it's actually about protecting the sovereignty of the state. And so I just think it's a really interesting controversy that, it's not so much the type of corruption that you might think about usually, but it's something that I think, could be looked at in the bigger system idea. The other picture, the modern building, that's the new Kockums. And I was actually at Malmö University with the computer science master's students. They had this helmet you put on, and you were supposed to look at something and think about it. They were trying to measure your brain and get your brain to take a picture with the camera on the helmet. And I actually got the camera to take a picture of the new Kockums building. So that's everyday militarism. This is in our lives everywhere, all the time. If you notice it, then you'll realize how much it's normalized. This is my last thing. This is actually about Adnan Khashoggi. He was the uncle of Jamal Khashoggi, the one that was dismembered and murdered by the Saudis. Adnan Khashoggi was one of the biggest arms dealers in the world, massively wealthy. And American University, which is my alma mater for my master's, they got a pledge from him to build a sports arena. And they were finally, look, we're gonna finally be able to do sports in this. And his name was there. And so every day when I took the shuttle bus from campus back to the metro to go home, I stood and saw Adnan Khashoggi's name. In the 90s, later in the mid 90s, he didn't come through with the pledge. And so they dropped his name from the building, but they wouldn't drop it before that when people protested about him being a part of that building, because donors make dream a reality, right? And I think this is just here you get a man who was corrupt and ruined people's lives. He was just an awful person, really, really wealthy. And it's connected with especially men's sports, because it was about men's college basketball at American, not about sports in general. So that's a misnomer there. But it's a bit of everyday militarism, and it links corruption, and it shows who's privileged, shows who gets, the kinds of authority to be able to do these kinds of things. I also saw the Red Hot Chili Peppers there. And then when I moved to Istanbul, I actually met him briefly at my company, but I didn't really know. It was a really weird experience. So these things come back, like corruption in the arms industry. If you start looking for them, you can actually see them in a lot of places. And that's because of the way the system works. So thank you very much. That's all that I had prepared. I hope that I didn't overtake my time. And
thank you, Susan.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I was a little bit ambitious with our timetable, but I always am. And then I realized that I don't want to interrupt people because they just have incredible knowledge to share. So I end up being stuck wanting to listen. But yeah.
Well, thank you.
I hope that, honestly, I just thank you so much for that presentation. I hope that we did really want to make time for everyone to have questions and answers. So I hope that maybe Andrew and Susan, you can stay a little bit longer than what we had originally planned to do a longer Q&A, because originally we thought we would stop in 20 minutes. So maybe also for the attendees, we really want this to be a space for open. Okay, that just as a side note. But honestly, Susan, thank you. just to summarize very quickly some main points, I think you really brought out like how corruption is a systematic problem which runs by very small and exclusive groups. The meaning construction within the arms industry and everyday militarism, and just the presence of everyday militarism without even realizing it sometimes, and the need for an intersectional and human security-centered approach, which we don't currently have, just to make that clear. Okay, now I'm going to give over to Ruth Rohde, who's going to be closing our more formal session. And Ruth Rohde is currently an undergraduate student at the University of Freiburg, Germany, as well as a peace and disarmament campaigner, beyond co-coordinating the corruption tracker. She's also a board member of the Arms Information Center in Germany, which is working on anti-arms right activism. Ruth is also an active member of ICANN Germany and has worked on peace and anti-corruption projects in Germany, the UK, and Canada, where I had the pleasure of meeting her a while back. Her presentation today will focus on introducing the corruption tracker a bit more, and specifically our website, how you can contribute cases, and generally how you can be involved in the corruption tracker project if you're interested. Ruth, I'm giving over to you, and thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Thanks so much, everybody who already presented. I'm going to try to be really quick, but I just really want you guys to get the input about the CT. Can you guys? No, you can't see my screen yet, right? Can you?
We can see it, but it's still on the kind of, we can see it. You still have to go in kind of slideshow mode.
I just wanted to make sure you saw it first. Okay, perfect. Okay, let's go. So I'm going to try to tell you guys a little bit about the CT, how it helps you, why it's cool, and what you can do to help us build it. And so, as Andrew already mentioned before, the purpose of the corruption tracker is to have, for the first time, an accessible, up-to-date online database of all cases and robust allegations of corruption in the global arms trade. And so the idea behind that is to really use the power that we have with amazing researchers like Andrew, with Susan, but also other cooperating partners that we're working with, journalists, activists around the world who just have so much knowledge on this issue, and really make it accessible and share resources that we all need to really bring some light into this industry that really thrives on intransparency. And so the way that we are approaching this right now is, you can see here just a few screenshots. So you can see our database at the top left. That's our website. I'm going to post a link later, and I'm going to have a more detailed view of that as well. But we also have very active social media presence, where we just spread the word on like corrupt arms deals, like show up some of the systematic issues with it. Most of it is run by Claudia, who you will meet a little bit later, and Julia as well. And so that's how we're approaching this right now. And so just to give you a little bit of an insight on how our database, which is our main website, is structured. And so you have, it's basically like online shopping just for corrupt arms deals. So instead of shopping for clothes, you would like search for like countries or companies or timeframes, and you can find the arms deals that we've recorded and fed into the database, and you can have a little bit of a sort of note on what they're all about, when they were active, what weapons were involved, that kind of thing. And so I really like to use this tool also when I need to look up things quickly. So it's a relatively standardized format where for each case you have like certain information on the case, you have some details on the case, a brief summary, and a summary of the legal challenges, those kinds of things, and the people involved, of course. So this is also a deal that Andrew already mentioned before, the CDU party funding scandal. I just really like to go back to our website for that. If I don't have the memory that Andrew has for all the like details and how many weapons were sold and how much money was involved and what role exactly Helmut Kohl played in all of it. And so I like to go back to the website and be able to look at those things in a very succinct manner. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this slide, which is, it's also on the website. It just details that we accept submissions for cases. So we really want to be an interactive platform where people can submit their research, participate, and yeah, and show their work, basically share their work. So where do we want to go? I like this quote from our friend Sam, who used to be a researcher at CIPRI as well, that says the corruption tracker will be the most comprehensive and up-to-date source of information on arms trade corruption, a crucial resource for those seeking to inform themselves on this dirty business. And this is basically really what we're aiming for. And so what we are trying to develop over the next year is to have more submissions, so more people submitting information on arms deals, more people contributing to the corruption tracker. And for this purpose, we also want to hold, we're currently in the process of developing a workshop series targeted at students and young people, specifically to empower them to conduct research and also create cases specifically for the corruption tracker. And so the point of all of it is that in the end, we aim to have an even more youth-led program and youth-led leadership, as well as more integration of people with intersectional identities. So we don't see like including women and young people as sort of a kind of reinforcement of the military-industrial complex. So if you guys, so a few years ago, I remember I was at a board meeting, no, sorry, not a board meeting, of course, at a shareholders meeting of Heckler & Koch, which is a Germany-based arms manufacturer. And I asked them why they had no women on their board. And they basically tried to tell me how it was great that essentially they had female secretaries and administrative staff. But of course, even if they had female board members, that wouldn't be enough, right? We want to not just have women become the new men in the military industrial machine. Instead, we want to really empower young people, women, people with intersectional identities to oppose that system that facilitates people's oppression. And so simple ways, sorry, I can't move my slide. Why not? Here we go. Simple ways you can get involved is, first of all, you should follow us on social media. It's a really easy step that everybody can do. We would really like it if you could share content that interests you with just your friends. We have usually found that talking about corruption is not something that a lot of people have thought about before. And so it's a lot of people react really in a really interested manner. And so if you have something that you see and that's interesting to you, we're really happy if you can share it. And that's why we provide really easily accessible information that's just ready for you to share. Of course, if you want to stay in touch, you can also sign up to our mailing list. I'm also going to put up the link again. So there we will also have the feedback and the follow-up on this webinar, but also we will post on other webinars and also the webinar series, the training webinar series that we're currently developing. And lastly, if you feel really inspired to contribute to the tracker, you can shoot us an email. We would love to get in touch. Also, if you have any ideas for improvement for the website, for social media, we're really looking to involve more people, especially also if you're interested in doing some research, in doing some social media content. I think everybody here who does the social media for the CT can agree it's really fun and interesting. Also, you learn a lot. And so, without further ado, I would like to end with this quote from our video editor, Noah, which I think is really good. She says, "Free information and transparency have the power to bring down corruption, ultimately fighting the arms industry and the violence it creates." I really like that quote, and I hope we can discuss a bit more. I'm also really interested in your perspectives on how we can have a more feminist lens integrated into the CT. And yeah, with that, I thank you for your attention. How do I stop?
Perfect. And then also I would say that we are actually stopping the recording now, just because we're closing the formal session.